Okay. I will start with an introduction. Today we are hosting the seventh roundtable discussion. It is chapter 2. Hopefully, we will look at museum studies in an intersectional way, thanks to our guest diverse background. Now we are with Attiat Gamal. She is currently doing her master's in Global Archaeology at Leiden University with a specialization in the Near East and Nubia. She finished a bachelor's degree in social anthropology from the University of Kent. Then she switched to archaeology when she realized that that was the route she wanted to take after doing a brief traineeship at the National Museum of Khartoum. She has been working on a few research projects around Sudan before and after the revolution. Her interests also lie in the museum studies and sustainable heritage protection. So I will start with a big question that the practice of anthropology has changed a lot in the last few decades from what it was before. As someone who has studied anthropology and is now studying archaeology, can you tell how you think this has an effect on practice of museums?
So thank you for having me, first of all. Secondly, I think it's really interesting that because I have a very European background in academia, that anthropology and archaeology are seen as such separate things. Whereas if you go to the US, it's actually different. You have to do both. They're usually under the same faculty. So I feel like, and when it comes to their connection with museology, the talk about decolonizing academia started generally in the late 1900s, I think in the 1980s. And so with that came about it was with the post-colonial period. So with that, we started questioning, why do we do the things that we do? And how do we do them? Like, is this ethical? So with that, it eventually moved on to how we look at museums and how we use museums as tools of education, if that helps at all.
Maybe I can ask, elaborate about the technological aspect, or maybe we can leave a bit later. Amal, what do you think?
Yeah, so for us, it's generally that we've seen that in the last few decades, there's been a very big shift in museums. So, for example, someone who was talking to us about it from an artistic perspective last week. So what do you think that the role of museums will be in the upcoming decades? And do you think that there should be any significant changes in how they operate from your perspective? Okay. Whether design, curatorial practice, or collections?
Okay. So I think that's a really, really big question. And the main answer for that is when we look at museums, especially, we have to really look at their colonial past. And not just in the matter of like, okay, this is what happened during colonialism, et cetera, but the roles of the museums themselves, because a lot of museums actually used to fund expeditions. And that's obviously a really, really big issue. So for example, that's very popular right now in the media and everything is the issue with the Benin bronzes, which I think started in about the 2010s. It became more in popular culture and more in the media and stuff. And so, so we have to look at that, and then we have to look and understand how that affected the practice of specifically of museology as theory. So, like I was saying, in the 1980s, decolonization, like the concept of decolonization in academia and stuff was happening. And so museology also started to really, really focus on that. But unfortunately, there's a really, really big disconnect between the actual theory and the practice. And in the last decade, especially, we can really see that a bridge is starting to happen through different ways, which I'll elaborate in a bit. But it's still just, it's not enough. And that is the problem with museums at the moment. But like completely eradicate them or remove them from society is, I would say, is a bit, it's kind of a big decision to make based on something that's actually, I would say that museums do hold an important role in current society, you know? And I think in the part one, you mentioned something about museums and narratives. And that's honestly, that's actually one of the big issues with museums, is that usually there is a narrative, you know? And so for them to have an important role in society, they have to do different things. One, they would have to recognize their past, okay? And through doing that is either through information or through the working of repatriation of objects. And again, I'll get into that a bit more into detail afterwards. And also through, through collaborative efforts. And finally, trying to be more relevant and to be a reflection of the society that they're in. So I think Ahmed also mentioned the point about movement and immigration and everything. And actually, I was thinking of a really interesting example. In Malmo in Sweden, there's a Museum of Movement, and really dedicated to, what's it called? The movement of refugees and everything that have gone through there, because obviously in the last 10 to 20 years, we've seen such a large influx of movement towards Europe. And so that's what that was dedicated with. That was what it was dedicated on. And also, what was really interesting about that project as well is that not just that, but it was collaborating with more grassroots projects, which I think is really, really important. And that's where it changes the whole concept of like a museum as purely a narrative of the curator, of the person who's running the exhibitions, like you said, the person who's running the museums. It's through collaborative effort. And also, when it comes to creation, it's more than just objects, taking them and bringing them back to wherever their source communities are from. It's more about starting at least that conversation, because we have examples where like certain communities didn't necessarily want objects back. They didn't mind that certain museums kept certain objects as long as they were involved in how the objects were treated and how the objects were displayed and all of that. And also, museums also have to start thinking about accessibility for disabilities. And also, museums are this fixed space, but they don't have to be. There was a really interesting project in Greece where there was a moving museum in a refugee camp, which is kind of a great idea. It reminds me a bit of the whole like Cabinet of Curiosities.
How it originally was, okay.
But it was honestly a really, really good initiative, because it means that museums don't necessarily have to be this fixed structure. You know, at the end of the day, a museum is a tool of education.
Yeah.
I mean, I would say as necessities of museum in the 1800s was maybe more related to establishing and justifying the nation states, like if we are talking about modern museum. And to me, having that educational power also justifies that them holding narrative and telling a certain truth about mostly past. It becomes even more dangerous when there's no involvement and feedback and variety in the curatorial group. And we are also very skeptical about projects related movement or refugees, just for the sake of being skeptical, and if they are performative or there's a real intention to change that system of museology, because that we are more interested in that individual cases, but maybe ICOM, UNESCO can take an action. But also we are really enjoying discussing that how do we position ourselves? It's do we want museums should end and there's no future for them because it's all that years they just propaganda of certain nations.
Yeah.
What's the way of penetrating that system without being, how to say, culture washed. It's very interesting.
I think it's also important to point out that we cannot necessarily put on the same playing field museums that are in Europe and museums, for example, that are in the global south, because they're also actually a product of colonialism, but they just don't have the same kind of history. And what you were talking about, the performativeness, you're right. Projects like that are actually very, they do come across as that. But that's what I meant when I was saying that collaborative efforts are also important. So this was by the museum. It was actually by working with actual people that work in camps, NGOs, that kind of thing. That's where that's why collaborative efforts are really important in museology.
And you, I was just thinking, because we were discussing narrative, and then last time we had a very interesting discussion about should there be, you know, like a fixed narrative when it comes to objects and stuff. And so this idea of having like one narrative given by the curator or given by the museum to the viewer, instead of having that interaction between, you know, people and the object. And maybe, you know, there was an idea of Ahmed was mentioning like a new idea of a museum where there's not that kind of narrative. So what would you think about that when it comes to, you know, from an archaeological perspective, when it comes to those kind of pieces, or from your background, because he comes from, you know, artistic, but you come from.
So I kind of understand the point that he's trying to make. And I feel like here is where the fault lies in how museums give out information. Like, it's very frustrating. I mean, I'm sure like we've all been to museums, we've all been to exhibitions, we've all been to galleries. And a lot of the time is that you'll have something that has so much history, so much cultural significance, and it's just placed there with a bunch of other objects with a very small plaque, if it's even this, that has a limited word count. And so that's my issue with how we display objects a lot of the time, is that it's very much kind of like in museums, this is an object, this is where it's from, end of.
Yeah.
So that's where that issue comes from. And also, I'm trying to think of other examples. I like to use examples when I talk about certain.
Help make this.
So, for example, when we display objects, it's so much more than just that, and how we view an object as well is also important. An object isn't just an object. It's not just a thing. It's something that does have agency. There is something there. It has material agency. It has a history. The person who made it, what it means, and all of that significance. And a lot of the time, when it's put in these museums, it kind of makes it stale and stagnant. It kind of makes like this one fixed, like, still object. Especially, this is very common in like ethnographic museums as well. When you do something like that, you're othering, or like you're objectifying these things. And a lot of the time, these objects aren't always objects. Sometimes it's human remains. Sometimes it's things that have religious significance, things like that. So that's the problem with just putting an object without any actual background, without working with the community that it comes from. That's where it creates that disconnect. That's why for a lot of people that like walk into ethnographic museums, people that walk into museums of artifacts and archaeology, it's just very much like you walk in, you see a bunch of things, and you walk out. And I think that's where the issue lies. It just makes them just objects. It disconnects them from the people.
Regarding that objectification problem, it's very true that decontextualizing an object and putting into display has a bunch of problems. But I've personally never seen an ethnography museum has done attempts to contextualizing an object without looking, I don't know, almost like kitsch, or, you know, like try to make second-hand empathy to the viewer. And I don't know, certain like almost like negative feelings, very theatrical, and it's still out of context. Even there's a bit of context around the object, it's still in a white box and in different geography. So maybe contextualizing ways needs to be discussed, and instead of literally making, like, surrounding the object with something, maybe bringing into more cultural background with a documentary or reading, and something else needs to be discussed. What do you think about that?
No, you're completely correct. And I feel like ethnographic museums are kind of a difficult one because ethnography in itself and the practice of anthropology is so like drenched in colonialism. It was birthed by colonialism. So that's definitely one of those types of museums where it's kind of hard for you to completely do that. It's hard for you to think about decolonizing an ethnographic museum while it still exists, if that makes sense, because it in itself is a product of colonialism.
And that was going to be my next question, is that are they useful today to have ethnographic museums? In a way they are. I'm not saying like the idea of having some of these pieces somewhere in a new version of a museum, but are ethnographic museums even in like, useful in certain contexts? Because the way, and that's the question like I just like to put out there into the table, because some people might think like, no, it depends on the way their presentation is. It depends on if it's within the same country, like the pieces, for example, is there an ethnographic museum in Sudan for Sudanese people where they understand the different types of, tribe, or because for me, it always has been a product of colonialism. And I'm just like, why do we have them till today? And so it's a very thorny issue for me. So I still don't know.
I know
how I feel about it.
And also, again, this is ethnographic museums in the context of Europe, not in the context of anywhere outside of that, to be honest. And you're right. I think it is very, very difficult for us to like completely say that this is how we can fix something like an ethnographic museum. But at the same time, the National Ethnographic Museum of the Netherlands is here in Leiden. And they had a really interesting exhibition on Oceania. And it was very different to like what normal ethnographic museums are. It was very interactive. It had people from the area, obviously, that were writing poetry. There was spoken word, which was really interesting. But then it made me question, okay, but who is running this?
Yeah.
Who are the curators? What has this museum done to like rectify a lot of the things that it has done in its past? Like, is it good enough for it just to be like, okay, this is how we're moving forward without taking that step back? I think that's a really big issue.
Yeah.
Can I continue or not?
Yeah. Next.
Okay.
Back to you, Esther.
Okay. I want if Attiat can make a bit of brief comparison about the access of technology shaping the museum curatorial vision and the collections narrative in Europe and outside of Europe, since she worked in Sudan and she knows the situation in Netherlands. Like, if there is this technological gap increasing or decreasing, or how it affects in different contexts.
Museums over the last maybe 5 to 6 years in general were trying very much so to like use their online, to have an online presence, to have like an online platform. But I think it was really, really skyrocketed with COVID and the pandemic. And if you want to talk about a comparison, obviously that's very, very difficult, if not close to like impossible to compare the two. So, for example, I think the National Museum has a website in Sudan, the National Museum in Khartoum. I think, and obviously it would be great for them to have an online presence of any kind. But, I mean, that's a bit of a long way for that. But the use of technology is really important, I would say, for accessibility when it comes to one, visibility, and two, for example, you have something like the British Museum, which is the museum of the world, where it's really the museum of the world because it's actually accessible from the world. So,
Yeah.
I was talking about having an online presence really just creates a completely new world for the curatorial practice. So, for example, the British Museum's online exhibition, it was a timeline, which obviously there's a lot of issues with that when you have things in a timeline, because it obviously insinuates that, you know, older societies are the reason why we're here now, and this is now these are the European collectives collections. Anyway, so yeah, I think technology in museums is really, really important, and it's definitely made a very big difference over the last 2 years. I think we see a huge amount of online exhibitions and museums in general putting their own work online, but that's again in the context of Europe. When it comes to the rest of the world, I had done some basic research a while ago on online exhibits in Africa, and I think I found like 2 or 3, like in the, which is obviously a massive issue, but at the same time, it's not as big of an issue for when you compare it to somewhere like Europe that has the resource.
So that's interesting. But we're moving, I think, now for
Yeah, we can slightly finalizing.
Yeah, the final question, and then if the conversation goes from there. And so as a final question, okay, when we talked in the first chapter, Roundtable with Ahmed, he mentioned, we were asking about a quotation that he made, and he said that the article was inspired by a work of Boris Groy, who's a German cultural critic and artistic critic, media, and all of that. And he talks about this transformation that happened to museums from a space to preserve antiques or to preserve history to a place of movement, which we kind of mentioned, and how is that, like, it was related to, you know, contemporary art movements and so forth. And so, but we want to go back to just kind of focus on that and have your perspective on, you know, the idea of moving a museum from that space to preserve history and antiques to a place where there's movement, there's a narrative where things are kind of not dynamic and not, you know, static. So if you can just give us your opinion.
So I completely agree with that in the sense that culture is not static. Culture is not something that is just stagnant. You can't have just like a snapshot of something, that an object, for example, that you acquired, let's say a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago. How relevant is that object now? How has that object changed? That's what I meant when I was talking about material agency. So when it comes to movement, it's not just about people, because I think the issue with museums, especially when we look at them like artifact museums and ethnographic museums, when it comes to Africa specifically, they portray things as very stagnant, very still, just objects, you know, and that's honestly one of the biggest issues with museums, and how museums are run, and how museums are the narrative of museums. Sorry, I'm losing my train of thought. So I think when it comes to movement and all of that, of course it makes sense. I mean, the world now is nothing to what it was 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. Humans have always been moving. We've always been immigrating. We've always been mobile. You know, I don't know if you heard on the news recently, they found evidence of Vikings in Canada well before when they actually thought people had arrived, you know. And so we've always been moving. There's always new information coming in of our movement. So I think it wouldn't make sense for us not to include that in how we view museums. Because again, like I said, culture isn't stagnant. It's not just this thing that's just there. Yeah.
You know, from that perspective, that is also very interesting, because we were talking the other time also because you were talking about material agency and objects and culture not being stagnant. And there was also this question about how museums, the way they display certain objects. And you were saying before that the idea of collecting and maintaining objects is such, European idea, and it comes there. And so we were discussing also the idea of museums themselves, you know, displaying or having other parts of cultures, like, you know, oral traditions or history and stuff. And so, and then we were talking about how technology can be useful for that, you know, as recording, and because that was not possible before. So what do you think about it, especially in a place like, for example, you know, Africa, Sudan, where the idea of collecting objects is not as strong, for example, as, you know, oral traditions and other places?
Yeah. So, yeah, I think that's what I meant when I was saying the whole like idea of collecting, displaying, and everything. That's a very European concept, and that's why now when you look at museums in the global south, especially like, again, I'm going to talk about the National Museum in Khartoum, it's not a museum with life. Like, you know, I call it the ghost of the colonial past because that is what it is. And so we need to start thinking about, like, in our communities, in our, like, in a more local setting, how do we preserve our own cultures? How do we display them, you know? And it's true, we do have a lot of oral traditions. And so things like that have to be included. The museum isn't just showing, it's so much more than just that.